October 14, 1884, marked the day the first frost settled over the valley of Oakhaven, a chilling precursor to a winter that would eventually become legend, though few recognized the signs at the time. The ground was hard as iron, ringing under the boots of the prospectors and cattlemen who sought fortune in the shadow of the jagged peaks. Among them walked Martha Vance, a woman whose silhouette was as stark and unyielding as the landscape itself. She was 40 years of age, her face etched with the lines of a life spent battling the elements, and she had recently buried her husband in the sodden earth of the valley floor, a victim of the spring floods that turned the town into a pestilent swamp. It was at the graveside, watching the muddy water seep into the fresh soil, that Martha made a silent vow never to be at the mercy of the low ground again. While the town of Oakhaven continued to expand outward, building flimsy wooden shanties and grand saloons on the floodplain, Martha turned her eyes upward toward the ridge that overlooked the settlement. There, standing solitary and immense against the skyline, was a great oak, a tree so ancient its roots were like the knuckles of the earth itself. When Martha purchased the steep, rocky plot of land containing the tree, the town's reaction was immediate and derisive. Silas Thorne, the town's wealthiest landowner and unofficial mayor, led the chorus of mockery from the porch of the Golden Steer Saloon. He was a man of expensive suits and cheap wisdom, convinced that dominion over the land meant flattening it. "Buying rock and bark, Martha?" Silas called out as she loaded her wagon with supplies, his voice dripping with condescension. "A woman alone needs a house on Main Street, not a perch for the vultures." Martha paused, tightening the cinch on her horse, and looked him dead in the eye. "The ground is a mouth, Silas," she said, her voice low but carrying clearly across the dusty street. "One day it will swallow this town whole. I intend to be out of reach when it does." The laughter that followed her exit was raucous, fueled by whiskey and the arrogance of men who believed they had tamed the frontier, but Martha did not look back, her mind already visualizing the architecture of her survival. The construction began not with a hammer, but with a rope. For the first 6 months, Martha Vance became a ghost to the people of Oakhaven, visible only as a distant figure hauling lumber up the treacherous switchbacks of the ridge. The great oak was a fortress of nature, its trunk as wide as a carriage, with branches that extended like the arms of a titan. Martha did not intend to injure the tree. She treated it as a partner, a living foundation that required respect. She spent weeks designing a friction-based support system, utilizing heavy iron bands and rubber padding aimed at gripping the bark rather than piercing it. It was grueling, back-breaking labor that would have crippled a lesser spirit. She utilized a complex system of pulleys and counterweights, hoisting massive beams of treated cedar 50 feet into the air. The physical toll was immense. Her hands became calloused leather, and her muscles grew corded and taut. Down in the valley, the townspeople watched the structure take shape with a mixture of confusion and amusement. They called it the Crow's Nest or Vance's Folly, making bets on when the first strong wind would send the crazy widow tumbling down the cliffs. Silas Thorne, observing the progress through a brass spyglass, saw only a waste of good timber. He rode up to the ridge one afternoon, his horse skittish on the loose shale, ostensibly to offer concern but truly to gloat. "You're building a coffin in the sky, Martha?" Silas remarked, looking up at the platform that now spanned the 3 largest branches. "When the winter gales come, this tree will sway like a drunkard. Come back to town. I'll rent you a room at a fair rate." Martha, perched on a beam with a level in hand, looked down at him. "The oak has stood for 300 years, Silas," she replied, wiping sweat from her brow. "It bends so it does not break. Your brick and mortar down there is rigid. Rigid things shatter," Silas scoffed, turning his horse around. "Stubbornness keeps you warm now, but it won't keep out the snow," he shouted back. Martha said nothing, merely returning to her work, driving a bolt home with a rhythmic, thunderous clang that echoed off the canyon walls. By the 3rd year, the structure had evolved from a simple platform into a marvel of frontier engineering. It was no longer just a shelter. It was a suspended homestead. Martha had constructed walls double-layered with wool and clay insulation, a technique she had learned from trappers in the north, ensuring that the interior would hold heat even in the deepest freeze. The main chamber was hexagonal, wrapping around the central trunk, which passed through the center of the room like a massive, living pillar. She sealed the gaps where the tree entered and exited the roof with flexible pitch and canvas, allowing the tree to grow and sway without compromising the seal. The most challenging aspect was the installation of a cast-iron stove, which required a winch system reinforced by steel cables to hoist. The chimney pipe was routed carefully to avoid scorching the branches, extending high above the canopy to catch the draft. Below the main living quarters, she built a suspended storage cellar, a hanging larder insulated against the heat and cold, which she began to fill with methodical desperation. She cured meats, jarred preserves, and stacked sacks of flour and dried beans, calculating the caloric needs for a winter that might last 6 months. The town of Oakhaven, meanwhile, was booming, blinded by a silver strike in the nearby hills. They built higher and faster, ignoring the subtle shifts in the climate. The summers were becoming brutally hot, the air stagnant and heavy, and the insects were swarming in unprecedented numbers. Martha observed these changes from her vantage point, noting the way the squirrels were hoarding nuts with frantic intensity and how the coats of the wolves were thickening earlier in the season. She ventured into town only for essentials, her presence now treated with a quiet unease rather than mockery. She was the eccentric on the hill, a figure of folklore in her own time. During one such trip to the general store, the shopkeeper, a kind but simple man, asked, "Expecting an army, Martha?" "That's enough grain for a regiment." Martha loaded the sacks onto her mule, her expression grim. "Not an army," she said softly. "Just a long night. The sky is changing color, Henry. Best you patch your roof." The 5th year brought a silence to the ridge that was both peaceful and terrifying. The treehouse was complete, a sprawling, interconnected sanctuary hidden amidst the turning leaves of the great oak. It featured a rainwater catchment system, a retractable rope ladder for security, and windows fitted with thick, expensive glass she had specially ordered from the east. It was a masterpiece of survivalism, invisible from the valley floor unless one knew exactly where to look. But as autumn deepened, the signs of impending catastrophe became impossible for Martha to ignore. The migration of the geese had happened weeks early, the sky was a bruised shade of violet at sunset, and the air held a metallic taste that pricked the lungs. The animals of the forest had vanished, retreating into deep burrows or migrating south, leaving the woods eerily quiet. Compelled by a lingering sense of duty to her former neighbors, Martha made one final descent into Oakhaven. It was late November, and the town was busy preparing for the harvest festival. She walked into the town hall meeting, her boots heavy on the polished floorboards, interrupting a speech by Silas Thorne about the projected profits for the coming year. The room went silent as she took the podium. "You need to prepare," Martha stated, her voice devoid of its usual reticence. "The livestock are huddled against the north walls. The sap in the trees is freezing before it hits the ground. A storm is coming that this valley has never seen." Silas laughed, a sharp, barking sound that encouraged the rest of the room to join in. "Always the prophet of doom, Martha?" Silas sneered, leaning back in his chair. "It's a mild autumn. The almanac predicts a gentle winter. Go back to your birdhouse." Martha looked around the room, seeing only amusement and pity in the eyes of the townsfolk. "The almanac was written by men in cities," she countered, gripping the lectern. "The land speaks the truth. Store wood. Board your windows. Move to higher ground." Silas stood up, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. "We are civilized people, Martha, not frightened animals. We will be fine." "You are dismissed." Martha stared at him for a long moment, realizing that hubris was a thicker wall than any she could build. "Then God help you," she whispered, turning and walking out into the gathering gloom. December 2nd arrived with a deceptive calm, the morning sun pale and watery behind a veil of high, thin clouds. By noon, the temperature began to plummet, dropping 20 degrees in the span of an hour. The wind did not howl initially. It arrived as a sudden pressurized vacuum that sucked the warmth right out of the valley. Martha, safe within the insulated walls of her treehouse, watched the barometer on her wall drop so low she thought the glass might crack. She secured the heavy wooden shutters, lit the cast-iron stove, and sat by the window overlooking the valley. Below, the town of Oakhaven was continuing its daily rhythm, oblivious to the white curtain of death racing toward them from the north. The first snowflakes were not flakes at all, but shards of ice, driven horizontally by a wind that suddenly roared to life with the sound of a freight train. Within minutes, the visibility dropped to zero. The White Death, as the old trappers called it, had arrived. In the town, the jovial atmosphere vanished instantly. The temperature plunged to 30 degrees below zero, freezing water in pitchers inside the homes. The flimsy wooden structures, built for quick expansion rather than endurance, began to groan under the wind shear. Roofs stripped of their shingles clattered into the streets like gunfire. Silas Thorne, sitting in his office at the bank, watched in horror as the large plate glass window bowed inward before shattering, sending a blast of Arctic air and glass shards across the room. Panic erupted in the streets. People tried to run for the church or the saloon, but the wind knocked them flat, the cold seizing their limbs within moments. It was a chaotic, terrifying scramble for shelter that was rapidly failing. As the sun set early, plunging the valley into a freezing darkness, the power of the storm intensified. The only light in the entire valley was not from the town, which was rapidly being buried and broken, but from a single steady golden glow high up on the ridge, a beacon from the coffin in the sky that was now the only warm place left in the world. The destruction of Oakhaven did not happen with the slow, creeping decay of years, but with the violent immediacy of an avalanche. By the third hour of the storm, the temperature had plummeted to a degree that defied the experience of even the oldest trappers, turning the moisture in the air into a suffocating fog of ice crystals. The structures on the valley floor, built of green lumber and hastily erected to house the influx of silver miners, began to fail in a cascading rhythm of destruction. The Golden Steer Saloon, the pride of Silas Thorne and the architectural anchor of Main Street, was the first to succumb. The immense weight of the snow, accumulating at a rate of inches per hour, combined with the shearing force of the gale to snap the main roof beam with a sound like a cannon shot. The collapse was total, burying the bar and the gaming tables under tons of timber and snow, forcing the patrons to crawl out into the blinding white void. Silas, stumbling out of the wreckage of the bank adjacent to the saloon, found himself standing in a world that had been erased. The street was gone, replaced by drifting dunes of white. The livery stable was a splintered skeleton, the horses having already broken loose and fled into the oblivion of the storm. Panic, raw and primal, seized the survivors. They huddled in the lee of the few remaining walls, their eyelashes freezing shut, their lungs burning with every inhalation of the sub-zero air. It was Henry, the shopkeeper, who first saw it, a solitary, unwavering star suspended in the black turmoil of the sky above the ridge. He pointed a trembling, frost-bitten hand upward, shouting over the roar of the wind. "The light! Look at the light!" The realization rippled through the freezing crowd. It was not a star, but the lamp in Martha Vance's window, shining from the very structure they had mocked as a folly. The town was a tomb. The treehouse was a beacon. The exodus began immediately, a desperate, disorganized struggle against gravity and the elements. It took 5 agonizing hours for the group of 30 survivors to navigate the distance that usually took 40 minutes on horseback. The switchback trail leading up the ridge was buried, indistinguishable from the sheer drops into the canyons below. They moved as a single, shivering organism, linked by lengths of rope scavenged from the ruined general store, dragging one another through waist-deep drifts. Silas Thorne brought up the rear, his expensive fur coat heavy with ice, his arrogance stripped away by the biting wind. Every step was a battle against the desire to simply lie down and sleep, the seductive lethargy of hypothermia creeping into their minds. The wind on the exposed ridge was ferocious, threatening to peel them from the mountainside. Yet the golden glow above grew steadily larger, a promise of warmth that drove them forward. As they neared the great oak, the sheer scale of Martha's creation became apparent even through the blizzard. The tree stood immovable, its massive trunk breaking the wind, while the house nestled within its branches seemed to float, secure and defiant. The survivors collapsed at the base of the trunk, their faces caked in ice, looking up at the dark underbelly of the platform 50 feet above. There was no way up. The rope ladder was retracted, coiled high out of reach. They were at the gates of salvation, but without the key. Silas, his voice a ragged croak, screamed up at the wooden fortress. "Martha! For the love of God! Martha!" The wind tore his words away, but the desperation in the group was a palpable force, rising with the storm. High above, the floorboards of the treehouse vibrated with the screams of the gale, but the structure held firm. Martha Vance sat by her stove, a rifle resting on her lap, listening not to the wind, but to the faint, rhythmic thumping on the trunk of the tree. She knew they were there. She had watched their lantern lights bobbing up the ridge like fireflies in a hurricane. She stood, wrapping a heavy woolen shawl around her shoulders, and walked to the trapdoor in the center of the floor. Opening it unleashed a blast of freezing air that swirled the sawdust on the floor, but she did not flinch. She peered down into the abyss, illuminating the scene below with a hurricane lantern. The light revealed a huddled mass of humanity, their eyes wide and pleading, their bodies swiftly being buried by the drifting snow. Silas Thorne looked up, his face a mask of terror and humility, his hands clasped together in a gesture of absolute begging. "We were wrong," he shrieked, the sound barely reaching her. "Open the gate, Martha. We are dying." Martha looked at them, the very people who had laughed at her labor, who had bet on her failure. She held their lives in her calloused hands. She did not smile, nor did she gloat. She simply reached for the heavy iron lever of the winch system she had designed to haul logs. "Stand clear," she bellowed, her voice amplified by the acoustics of the hollow trunk. She released the brake, and a large cargo net, reinforced with leather and steel, descended rapidly into the white darkness. The process of loading the survivors was slow and perilous, a mechanical ascension from hell into heaven. The winch groaned under the strain, the steel cables singing tight as Martha and the strongest of the first group, Henry the shopkeeper and a blacksmith named Cole, worked the crank. One by one, and then in pairs, the freezing townspeople were hoisted into the hexagonal sanctuary of the treehouse. As they spilled out onto the warm wooden floor, they gasped not just for air, but at the shock of the temperature difference. The interior was 80 degrees, heated by the roaring cast-iron stove and retained by the double-walled insulation. The air smelled of dried sage, cedar, and baking bread, a sensory overload for people who had spent the last 6 hours inhaling ice. The room was spacious, far larger than it appeared from the ground, with the massive trunk of the oak passing through the center like a warm, living pillar. Martha moved among them with the efficiency of a field medic, handing out blankets, pouring mugs of hot broth, and directing them to the corners of the room to distribute the weight evenly. Silas was the last to be hauled up. He tumbled onto the floorboards, shivering violently, his expensive boots ruined, his status in the valley erased by the snow. He looked up at Martha, who stood over him with a ladle of broth. I told them you were mad," he stammered, his teeth chattering. Martha placed the mug in his shaking hands. "Madness is building on sand, Silas," she said quietly. "Sanity is building on stone and oak. Drink." For 4 days, the storm raged with apocalyptic fury, burying the valley of Oakhaven under 20 feet of snow. Inside the treehouse, the atmosphere was one of hushed reverence and forced intimacy. The structure swayed gently in the highest winds, a sensation that initially terrified the guests but eventually rocked them into a rhythmic calm. The engineering held true. The friction bands gripped the bark without slipping. The flexible pitch seals kept the drafts out, and the stove burned efficiently, fed by the cords of seasoned hardwood Martha had stacked in the rafters. The social hierarchy of the town had been completely dismantled. In the treehouse, Silas Thorne was no longer the mayor. He was merely another mouth to feed, another body taking up space. Martha was the undisputed authority. She rationed the food with mathematical precision, dried venison, pickled beets, and hardtack, ensuring her stores would last. She organized shifts for maintaining the fire and melting snow for water. There was no room for argument, and no one dared to challenge her. They watched her check the tension bolts and monitor the barometer with a newfound awe. The irony was lost on no one. The woman they had ostracized was the only reason they were still breathing. On the morning of the 5th day, the howling stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Martha unlatched the heavy shutters and pushed them open. The blinding brilliance of the sun flooded the room. Below them, the world had changed. Oakhaven was gone. There were no roofs, no streets, no landmarks. Only a pristine, undulating ocean of white. The only thing standing in the entire valley was the great oak. Silas stood beside Martha at the window, looking down at the erasure of his empire. Tears streamed down his face, not from cold, but from a profound, crushing realization of his own insignificance. "It's all gone," he whispered. "Everything we built." Martha rested a hand on the rough bark of the tree trunk running through her living room. "Not everything," she corrected, looking out at the horizon where the sun was rising over the peaks. "The roots held. And so did we." The confinement within the canopy lasted for 10 weeks, a period that reshaped the soul of the community far more than the storm had reshaped the landscape. The treehouse, once mocked as a hermit's folly, became the cradle of a new civilization. In the close quarters of the hexagonal room, the social stratifications of the old Oakhaven dissolved completely. Currency, land deeds, and titles were rendered meaningless. The new currency was caloric discipline, patience, and the ability to knot a rope. Martha did not rule with an iron fist, but with the quiet, absolute authority of competence. She taught the survivors how to read the groans of the wood, how to ration water by melting snow slowly to preserve the minerals, and how to sleep in shifts to maximize the warmth of the stove. Silas Thorne, stripped of his desk and his ledger, struggled the most. In the second week, he attempted to buy an extra ration of dried beef with a promise of future gold, holding out a trembling hand to Martha. She did not even look up from the garment she was mending. "Ice does not take coins, Silas," she remarked, her voice flat and final. "Hunger has no price tag. You eat when we eat." Shamed by the silence of the room, Silas retreated, eventually finding his place not as a leader, but as the tender of the fire, a task he performed with a newfound, silent diligence. The crow's nest became a school of survival, where the arrogance of the frontier was replaced by a humble respect for the ferocity of nature. When the Chinook winds finally blew in late March, turning the white wasteland into a churning river of slush, the survivors prepared for the descent. The rope ladder was lowered, and one by one, the people of Oakhaven returned to the earth. The devastation that awaited them was absolute. The floodwaters from the melting snow had finished what the wind had started. The valley floor was scoured clean. Foundations had been washed away, and the safe, flat land Silas had prized was now a marshland of debris and mud. There was nothing to reclaim, no buildings to patch. The town was erased. Standing in the mud, the group looked back up at the great oak, which stood unharmed on the rocky ridge, its roots gripping the stone as firmly as ever. The contrast was a brutal lesson in geography and hubris. Silas stood by the ruins of his bank, poking a stick into the mud where his vault used to be. He looked older, smaller, but his eyes were clear for the first time in years. He turned to the group, then to Martha, who was checking the soil stability near the tree line. "We cannot build here again," Silas announced, his voice raspy but steady. "The bottom is for the water. We build on the rock." It was the first time he had spoken a truth that Martha did not need to correct. Oakhaven was reborn, but it was no longer the town of Silas Thorne. Under Martha's guidance, the settlement moved up the slopes, integrating into the landscape rather than imposing upon it. They built homes of stone and cedar, anchored into the bedrock, designed with the same principles of insulation and flexibility that had saved their lives. The great oak remained the center of the community, not as a home anymore, but as a monument. The treehouse was maintained with religious fervor, kept stocked and ready, a permanent reminder of the winter that the sky fell. Martha Vance lived out the rest of her days not as a pariah, but as the matriarch of the ridge. She never sought office or title, content to remain in her cabin near the base of the tree, watching the seasons turn with the knowing eye of a guardian. When she finally passed, decades later, during a quiet autumn evening, the town did not bury her in the soft, dangerous earth of the valley. They laid her to rest on the high ridge, beneath the canopy of the Titan that had saved them all. The marker was simple, a rough-hewn stone bearing no dates, only a name and a single line of advice that had become the creed of the new Oakhaven. Roots deep, head high and above her grave, the treehouse swayed gently in the wind, a lantern still hanging in the window, ready to be lit against the dark.